Hello and good morning. You are very welcome to this year active debate on the Gigabit Infrastructure Act. Now, earlier this year, the European Commission put forward its proposals aimed at streamlining the world of connectivity across the European Union. And today's event is especially timely as the ITRE committee in the European Parliament, that's the industry committee, adopted its position. So we will be hopefully joined later by the rapporteur and MEP to discuss that as well. Let me introduce you, however, to our speakers today who are going to guide us through this very important act and what it might mean down the road in terms of implementation, in terms of enforcement, and in terms of what it will mean for Europeans and consumers in their connectivity and digital needs for the next decade or so. Joining us from DG Connect in the European Commission is the Director of the Connectivity Department. It's Camilla Klock. Thank you so much, Camilla, as always. We also have Emilio Davila, who is the Digital Transformation Seconded Expert at the Permanent Representation of Spain to the EU. Mieke de Recht is Councillor for Digital and Telecoms at the Permanent Representation of Belgium to the EU. Kostas Massalos is Chair of the BEREC and President of Hellenic Telecommunications and Post Commission. Thank you very much, Kostas. And last but by no means least, Leopold van den Berg is the Interim CTO and Executive Director of Technology for Vodafone Ziggo. Thank you all so much for joining us. It's going to be, I hope, an interesting and fruitful conversation. And I would like as many of you as possible to jump in with your thoughts and really get into the meat of what this might mean. But I'm going to start, Camilla, with you because the Commission proposed this act with very clear aims in mind. So tell us a bit about that, how we got to where we are today and what were the main considerations in proposing it.
Thank you very much for your question, Jennifer. Indeed, we proposed this act because we have done evaluation of the previous directive, Broadband Cost Reduction Directive, and the results were not too encouraging. I think the problem which we encountered was that with directive, which was also giving a lot of flexibility to member states in terms of how they could interpret at the end of the day the rules, was very long and was not super effective and basically did not allow us to achieve what we wanted. That's why we decided also to go this time for regulation. For us, GIA is Gigabit Infrastructure Act is basically legislation that would allow us to enable faster, cheaper and more efficient rollout of gigabit networks. It is also very much essential element of our broader strategy with Digital Decade connectivity targets, in particular the gigabit connectivity for all. So for us, it's essential element of our broader approach to connectivity sector, making sure that we indeed reach the targets. And it's essential puzzle in this bigger picture.
Thank you very much, Camilla. And I know there have been some pushbacks on certain elements, and as always with anything proposed by the Commission, it goes through a series of changes. We will talk about that over the next hour and a half. So we're going to turn now, as I said, to our rapporteur on the Gigabit Infrastructure Act from the European Parliament, Alan Mituta. Alan, there was a vote yesterday. Tell us where we're at. Give us the latest news for those who haven't had a chance to read it overnight.
Yes, thank you, Jennifer, and great to be here with you. Indeed, we had a vote yesterday in the ITRE committee, and it was a successful vote because our position was adopted largely. 48 votes in favor, only 1 against. So we have a very strong mandate now to negotiate with the Council. We hope that the Council will also reach very soon a compromise text, and we will start of course, the negotiations. I think, as Camilla also said, this is a very important piece of legislation because, we talk very much about AI, we talk about data economy, but all of this is not possible without having the necessary infrastructure. So the Gigabit Infrastructure Act is really the centerpiece of the economy of tomorrow, of the AI aspects of the economy of tomorrow, of the data economy that we try to build in the European Union. And I think this is really this GIA Act, as I said, it's a essential element of this puzzle. Basically, in what we adopted yesterday in ITRE, we try to have a better version of what the Commission put on the table. I must say that the Commission did a great work, and from the start, the proposal of the Commission was very good. We tried to better it in some areas, such as, for example, we put a lot of emphasis on rural areas and scarcely populated areas, and there we have a stronger text now. I think we also managed to introduce to have a better, let's say, framework for the tower companies, which are essential in supporting gigabit infrastructure in this scarcely populated and rural areas. And we also try to simplify a little bit the procedures. We also shortened the deadlines for permit granting to 2 months, extendable by 3 months. In the Commission proposal, we had 3 months and then extendable by without limit. So I think this goes in the direction of helping the companies to extend their gigabit infrastructure in the European Union, as it is the objective of the Digital Decade program, which says clearly that by 2030, we must provide European citizens and companies with gigabit access all over Europe. So this is very important for us. We have a strong mandate now in the Parliament, and I'm very happy to discuss the elements, specific elements of our proposal. But I think, as I said, this is a very strong text that we have on the table, and we are looking forward to negotiate with the Council.
Well, indeed, we are going to be talking now to two representatives from different countries, from Spain and Belgium, because, of course, the question of harmonization across the EU is a big one, and it could become one of the sticking blocks because not all countries are operating from the same position. Let's start, Emilio, with the perspective of Spain.
Yeah. Thank you, Jennifer, and thanks for organizing this event. More than the perspective of Spain is the perspective of the presidency of the Council that I will try to talk about. So, as you know, digital economy is one of the pillars of our presidency of the Council. And why? Because in this challenging world that we have now, we believe that digital transformation and technologies is really key to preserve the competitive position and the leadership of the European Union in the global context. And we agree with what both the Commission and the Parliament has said, and I think that following the discussion at Council level, this is clear that everybody is interested in having the GIA approved as soon as possible. And this is one of the important files within the Spanish presidency. Why? Because as the previous speakers have explained, connectivity is key if we want to ensure all the position of the European Union globally, but also to guarantee the connectivity and the targets of the Digital Decade 2030. And more than that, also, if we want to reach all the benefits that the digital transformation can bring to both business and citizens, we need to have a reliable and connectivity that arrives to all, in order also to bridge the digital divide. And in that sense, we think that the GIA is an important piece of legislation that could bring both legal security, but also could reduce the cost of the deployment of the broadband and gigabit infrastructure in the Union. Camila has explained that unfortunately the previous directive didn't reach the target, so we are trying to work in the Council to also have a common position, and this is one of the priorities of the Spanish president, to have at least a general approach or a mandate to be able to negotiate with the Parliament and with the Commission before either we have the mandate by the end of the presidency, and then we will see, depending on the current discussions in the Council, whether we can start already the negotiation within the Spanish presidency, or we can only launch it and then support the next presidency, which will be Belgium, in order to conclude. But I think that at Council level, everybody believes that this is an important file, and we should have, before the end of the term of the Parliament and the Commission, the file approved. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Emilio. Well, Mika, Emilio has set it up there rather for you, because Belgium is, of course, taking over the presidency from January. Give me the perspective, if you like, from Belgium, and then, as Emilio pointed out, taking over the reins of the Council.
Thank you, Jennifer. And let me start with congratulating the rapporteur as well for the very convincing vote he received yesterday. And indeed, as he mentioned, a very strong mandate to start the negotiations. Indeed, and I think, as previous speakers have said, there's definitely a shared responsibility from the Council and the Parliament to adopt the best legislation possible, to help the sector deploy the high-speed broadband networks and to help them reach the digital decade target, because that's what it's all about. And from our perspective, Belgium is one of those countries that is lagging behind a bit on the fiber rollout. But I see today our telecom operators are deploying fiber, they're opening the streets. So timing is really key, timing is of essence. And as you know all very well, it takes quite a while in Brussels before legislation to kick in, to come into force. So it's today the operators are deploying their fiber, and not in 2027, 2028. So that's why the negotiations on the Gigabit Infrastructure Act will definitely be a core priority during the Belgian presidency. Together with our Spanish colleagues, of course, we are very determined to bring this file successfully over the finish line before the end of the legislative mandate. Now, looking at the discussions in the Council, and Camilla and Emilio have said it before, the current BCRD has not been effectively enforced or implemented in some countries. So from the Council perspective, it's very important that the rules and the measures that are in the text will actually be effective. And we see that the current proposal represents a considerable financial and also administrative burden especially for local authorities, public sector bodies, but also for telecom providers and owners of public physical infrastructure. So many member states have stressed it is important to reduce this burden to the extent possible to make sure we have an effective and successful instrument, and that the benefits of the Gigabit Infrastructure Act can really be reaped. So there has been some concerns raised by the member states regarding the implementation deadlines. So yeah, timing is of essence, timing is key. However, member states do see they need sufficient time to properly implement the improvements that have been proposed by the Commission in the GIA compared to the BCRD, and to make sure they provide the additional resources as well, especially regarding the digitalization of the single information points. So also, for example, the shortening of the deadlines for dispute settlement bodies to sort out disputes is something that some member states fear might not be realistic and might not be applicable in practice. So these are some issues that we will be further looking at in the coming weeks at within the Council with the member states. And then, as Emilio said, we hope to start negotiations together with the Spanish presidency, of course, as soon as possible with the Parliament, because they are definitely ready to kick off the negotiations.
Thank you indeed. We are going to come back to that question of timing because there are parliamentary elections next May and we have got the digital decade running away from us. It'll be 2024 by then already, which is taking us very close to 2030. But Kostas, let me turn to you for the regulator's position. Picking up on some things Mika said, tell us a bit about what are the changes with the GIA and how do we avoid the pitfalls of the BCRD and make sure that this time we get it right?
Thank you, Jennifer. It's really great to be in this panel today. Well, let me start briefly with the general context for the Gigabit Infrastructure Act. We know the objectives of the Digital Decade Policy Program. They are very ambitious with regards to ICT and build around safe and secure digital infrastructures. And indeed, telecommunications networks are the platform for digital transformation and digital economy. And on top of that, we need to also consider sustainability objectives. So we face a twin digital and green transition challenge in a less than favorable economic environment of high debt, high inflation, high interest rates. Specifically with regards to connectivity, we have two very ambitious connectivity objectives: 1 gigabit per second fixed connections for all users in Europe by 2030 and coverage by 5G or equivalent wireless networks of all populated areas in Europe. And if we see the developments so far in Europe, they are quite good. For example, we have 81% coverage with 5G today in Europe. However, this is mostly based on spectrum of 4G and deployments around the very important 3.6 gigahertz spectrum are more limited, and the coverage is 41%. And more or less, we have a similar situation with fiber networks deployment with a coverage around 55%. And penetration much less, and so we still need to improve, and also compared to other regions of the world like South Korea, China, US, Japan, United Arab Emirates. So we need policy and regulatory action to address investment challenges first, to optimize costs and speed up network deployments, and also address the demand side, because we need networks to be available to European citizens and financially viable in the long term. So in this direction, Gigabit Infrastructure Act legislative proposal aims to facilitate and stimulate the rollout of very high capacity networks by optimizing administrative procedures and civil engineering costs. So obviously contributes in achieving the very ambitious objectives we have defined for 2030. The Gigabit Infrastructure Act, in my opinion, addresses three broad issues: the access to existing physical infrastructure and coordination of civil works, the in-building physical infrastructure, which is very important, and maybe we will come back to this later, and the procedures for granting permits. Three very critical points. Differences compared to BCRD of 2014, it's a regulation. The proposal is for a regulation and not a directive this time. The scope is more focused on very high capacity networks. All the requests for access to physical infrastructure have to be met not only by electronic communication network operators, but also by operators of associated facilities and public sector bodies, and this is important. Very important and central is the single information point foreseen in the Gigabit Infrastructure Act. So operators of networks or associated facilities and public sector bodies have to make the minimum information concerning their passive infrastructure available in this single information point, as well as the planned civil works. The dispute settlement body is also very central, and deadlines indeed have been reduced with regards to dispute settlement. And there are also new provisions for permit granting authorities trying to reduce deadlines and speed up the administrative processes. So in a summary, these are the key points of Gigabit Infrastructure Act, which I believe is a very important component policy tool in order to allow us achieve our connectivity objectives for 2030.
Thank you, Kostas. Leopold, let me turn to you from the, if you like, the industry side. You have a lot of, as they say, skin in the game. Give us your reaction to the proposal and where you think the direction of travel is and what we will end up with eventually.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. And we thank the EU institutions for engaging in the debate around the future digital networks of Europe, as they will be the enabler of future innovations and future growth in the EU. So if we indeed specifically look at the Netherlands, we see that we have already met one of the 2030 digital decade targets, as were set by the Commission, being the nationwide coverage of gigabit networks. As of December 2022, when we completed our gigabit rollout, we are providing nationwide coverage of our fixed gigabit infrastructure using our hybrid fiber coaxial DOCSIS standard. Nationwide, meaning 92% of all the homes passed in the Netherlands we reach, which equals to approximately 7.3 million households. So this network uses mostly fiber and provides coaxial links in the last mile, which gives us a great advantage to limit our digging activities using mostly existing infrastructure. Going forward, we see a bright future for HFC network infrastructure, which will be in a head-to-head competition with full fiber players, and which will reach speeds up to and beyond 10 gigabit per second in the medium term, using the so-called DOCSIS 4 technology. We also have been engaged in a network test in May earlier this year, where we reached speeds higher than 15 gigabit per second. So we believe that the Dutch case shows that using HFC networks can prove a very efficient way in continuously upgrading European future networks. And we would therefore also, in that sense, urge the European Commission to continue their technology-neutral approach regarding the implementation of future networks, and therefore the continuation of the notion of very high-capacity networks, VHCN, which enable the inclusion of other hybrid forms of network infrastructure like HFC in the total European digital strategy. Thanks.
Thank you very much for all of your opening positions. So I think we've really set the scene, but there is a lot to debate and to discuss. And I want to remind all of the audience tuning in today that you can put your questions to our panelists. You can scan the QR code there that you see on the screen, or go to slido.com and use the hashtag Gigabit. And I see some of you already taking the opportunity to type into the box underneath the video to put your questions to our panelists. So we will try to get to as many of those as possible before our time runs out. Camilla, let me come back to you and ask you about this question of how to achieve harmonisation. I mean, how can the EU ensure that the legislation is harmonised? There are very different starting points across the different EU 27. And I know we're saying it is a regulation, not a directive, which guarantees a certain amount more of harmonisation. But there's a huge difference between different member states with regard to the degree of blanket duct coverage or with regard to fibre to the home deployment. Tell me about those considerations when you put forward a proposal like this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for your question. Yes, indeed, there are differences between member states, and I think it was already mentioned by Kostas and by other speakers before that. In some extent, we are getting on coverage in terms of gigabit connectivity relatively close to the targets that we achieved. But there are many member states also, and all the regions, in particular the rural areas, that are certainly lagging behind. So this regulation is, in our opinion, absolutely needed to make sure that we have we achieve the coverage targets of the DPP in terms of the gigabit connectivity. Going back to the legal form of what we proposed, the reason why we proposed regulation, and I'm very happy to hear that it is very much recognized by many of the speakers, was to ensure that we handle the problems that we have experienced with directive. But regulation it is minimum harmonization instrument. So it gives flexibility to the member states to approach their specific situations. So it's not like it is very firm rules on everything set in stone. It gives the necessary flexibility to the regulators, to member states, to address specific issues and to move ahead. So I think this is important, and this is also important for the negotiations that we'll have ahead of us. That's one element. The second element, which makes us more optimistic that with regulation we might address issues faster than what we were trying to do with the directive, is the fact that the regulation entry into force would be simply quicker. So we don't have to go through lengthy, sometimes transposition process in the member states, as it was also the case with broadband cost reduction directive. So I think this mix of elements that regulation provides us, first of all, it's minimum harmonization. So it sets some general rules, but it gives flexibility to member states, local authorities on exact interpretation and implementation of these rules, respecting basically the local circumstances. On the other hand, it also allows us, because it's regulation, for the entry into force that should be relatively quick, which would be one of my big pleas to the co-legislators when we discuss this regulation in the trilogues, that we also need to ensure that what we agree is entering into force quickly, so we can see the benefits on the ground as quickly as possible. The digital decade is around the corner, 2030, so we really need to see these rules applicable as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Alan, speed is of the essence. I'm sure you're aware of the clock ticking down for the term of the European Parliament. How are you going to approach these trilogue negotiations after the Parliament plenary has approved the position, I presume? Is speed at all costs the real way forward, or are there going to be sticking points and red lines that you won't cross?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I fully agree with Camila by saying that we need this new piece of legislation in the form of a regulation, because we saw already that the directive didn't provide us with the necessary legal instruments in order to ensure that we have this kind of harmonization, which will allow us to reach the 2030 targets. So this is important to have a regulation. It's important also in terms of speed, because regulation doesn't need an implementation at the member states level, so it will be implemented directly in the member states, and this is very important. Then, on the in the sense of the negotiations, I think for us, for the Parliament, we already sent a clear message by having the vote yesterday in ITRE after only a couple of months of negotiations. We negotiated quite fast in the Parliament because we think that the Gigabit Infrastructure Act, it's really important, not only because we have elections next year and we want to finish our work by the end of the mandate, but also because what I said in the beginning of a discussion, the fact that this is a centerpiece of legislation and we need to build on this in order to have the other parts of the puzzle which will complete the connectivity package. So I think this Gigabit Infrastructure Act is very important, as I said, and we are looking forward to start the trilogues as soon as possible. I know that the Council and the Spanish presidency are doing a great job in the Council in order to have a mandate. I'm confident that we can start the trilogues as soon as possible. I don't know, maybe we can have some trilogues this year. Ideally, it would be to close the deal this year, but of course this will depend a lot on what will be the position of the Council. The position of the Parliament is now adopted and transparent, so we are looking forward to see if we'll have major discrepancies between Council and Commission, Council and Parliament. But I'm optimistic that we'll have a good negotiations in the trilogues, as I said, as soon as possible.
Well, I think, Emilio, now is a good time to bring in one of our questions from Theo Hartmann, asking whether the Spanish presidency will push for tacit approval principle in its second compromise text at the Council. That could prove problematic for some member states. What's your plan on that?
Well, you will allow me not to enter into such a level of detail when we are discussing now what will be the compromise test, and we are checking with all the different delegations and colleagues how this can be done. But indeed, as some have anticipated in a slide, there are still, and this is a fact, some issues at discussion of the Council. And why? Because at the Council level, we want, and I think this is a common view from all the different institutions, to have an effective instrument, which also be agile and flexible, adapted to the different situations for the member states. And this is what we are trying to achieve with the second compromise from the Spanish presidency. So looking at all the different situations that are in the member states, seeing what are the legal reality, and working also with together with our legal service in order to find out which are the possible ways to keep this push for a minimum harmonization, which would allow reduction of burden and bureaucracy at EU level, whilst keeping into account the different realities of the member states. And this is what we are doing now, and this is where we're trying to put in the second compromise, and we hope that this could be acceptable by the different delegations, because again, the aim of everybody is to have it approved as soon as possible. But of course, we don't need to forget that we need the right balance in order to have a real effective instrument, which also should allow to, as somebody has said, to promote the investment in the gigabit. So we are considering all the possible options in order to try to find a compromise with all the member states as soon as possible. But we will see what happens with the discussions. Thank you.
Well, Mika, by the time this falls to the Belgian presidency, obviously a lot of work will already have been done. But let me ask you then about the specifics of how to preserve best practices from different member states as you really get into the fine-tuning of the Act, and then looking ahead to what enforcement look like. I will come on to Kostas for that. But Mika, tell me a bit about preserving a floor, if you like.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because actually during the most recent ministerial council we had in June, the Telecoms Council, there was a debate between the ministers on how to foster the telecommunications and electronic sector, and how to promote also the rollout of broadband and reach the digital decade targets. And what came out of the debate, or one of the things, was that many member states have already taken national or local initiatives, very targeted, specific measures to help roll out the broadband in, for example, white zones. Or they had issued vouchers for fiber deployment or 5G deployments. And the fact that this local initiatives have been taken already is one of the arguments that some member states use to actually change the form of the instrument to a directive, because they fear that if the GIA would be a regulation, it would undo these local national measures. Now, this has been discussed in the Council, and we've seen that the Spanish presidency really clarified the issue of the flexibility, the national flexibility member states have, and the issue of the minimum harmonization. So I think many of the concerns member states have now been addressed. But it was stressed very much that the national initiatives to promote the deployment of broadband should be able to stay around, because, as you mentioned also in your introduction, there's a lot of different technologies, there's a lot of different underlying physical infrastructure in the member states, and so therefore there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Well, indeed, there isn't, but there is an aim to get everyone to the same standard. Kostas, what would BEREC like to see, perhaps in terms of improvements or developments, given that there is still a small bit of room for manoeuvre in the Act?
Well, indeed, I think in policy and regulatory work, we will always find room for improvement. But first of all, I would like to say that BEREC welcomes the initiative from the Commission for the Gigabit Infrastructure Act. As I said, we believe this is a very important building block tool, regulatory tool, to achieve the 2030 connectivity objectives and targets. Of course, we can always identify some points that could further enhance the impact of Gigabit Infrastructure Act. For example, BEREC thinks it is important to also include state aid funded electronic communication network deployments in order to ensure, in the scope of Gigabit Infrastructure Act, in order to ensure that public funds are also used as efficiently as possible. So a kind of making the scope of Gigabit Infrastructure Act broader would be interesting, and also maybe include the deployment of network elements that can contribute to very high capacity network deployments. For example, fiber rollout in general would also enhance the impact of Gigabit Infrastructure Act. With regards to the deadlines and the administrative processes, of course, one of the important aims of Gigabit Infrastructure Act is to speed up the deployment and the relevant administrative processes. In some cases, this reduction in deadlines, of course, they will speed up the processes, but we need to consider also the quality of the decisions and whether a compromise in the quality of the decisions could cause any counter effects in the end. So instead of speeding up the deployment, maybe have some slower rates because of compromised quality of the decision. And for example, you mentioned tacit approval of rights of way. This could fall under this case. Also, we believe that the coordination of civil work should also apply to fully or partially publicly financed civil work, including associated facilities, but should not prevent coordination of privately financed civil work, as this would also contribute to the achievements of the Gigabit Infrastructure Act. And some member states have already introduced schemes like this. So overall, I believe Gigabit Infrastructure Act addresses very relevant issues. It is very important tool to allow us achieve our connectivity objectives toward 2030. In our opinion, there is still room for improvement.
Well, I think, as you said at the outset, that there's always room for improvement. Nothing is ever 100% perfect, especially not in the policy world. However, we can get on the right track. So, Leopold, I've asked for the regulator perspective on what needs to improve. Give me your perspective from an industry side, as it were.
Yeah, I think a couple of things that already have been said, and I want to emphasize what is important from our point of view is the technology neutrality point of view, where indeed hybrid networks like the HFC network that we have in VodafoneZiggo in the Netherlands, it can deliver multiple gigabit speeds now and in the midterm future. And the advantage of using that is that we only need to open up the ground on a macro network level and not for every individual household, which limits the disturbance for customers to an absolute minimum, unlike the fiber deployments that are currently ongoing. And to add, I think we should not be looking at one size fits all solution. There can be local initiatives that are different as long as they meet the Gigabit Act, the Giga Act requirements. So it's not one size fits all, but local initiatives can also be working very well in this respect.
Thank you. Camilla, this question of technology neutrality is one that has been leveraged as a criticism against the proposal. How do you react to that? It's a big talking point.
First of all, I don't see the reason for this criticism because technological neutrality is fully enshrined in the proposal. As you know, basically all articles are based on the very high capacity networks definition that is in the code, which is based on the basically performance of the networks. Currently, indeed, including in the way we measure it, DOCSIS 3.0, also for the purpose of the measurement of the digital decade connectivity targets. I think and there is, on the other hand, I have to admit that what we see for sure in terms of the developments right now in the market is slow but sure shift from cable networks towards fiber networks. And we also see it in the context of also cable companies. Some of them decide to enhance their technologies and move to DOCSIS 3.0, or even, as you mentioned, test the DOCSIS 4.0. But majority of the developments we see in the market is the shift towards fiber. Where I think the controversy might be starting on the technology neutrality in the context of the GIA is in two particular articles which are dealing with in-building provisions. So basically proposing fiber for in-building provisions. But here I really think that we got this right. We really believe strongly that fiber is necessary in terms of the in-house building solutions. And we also, what is very important, would like to mention that the in-house wiring is not part of the code provisions, because the code provisions on very high capacity networks and definition is addressing the issue of the networks. In-house wiring is not necessarily included under this definition. So I think we got it right. I think we are very much also in line with what we are talking, not only in the code, but also in the Digital Decade Policy Program, which indeed is focusing on the gigabit coverage and is technology neutral. But here we are following the same trend, but in terms of the in-house wiring, we stay quite firm that it's necessary to have fiber, which is simply, in that case, the best solution and future-proof solution.
Alan, let me put the same question to you. There is a perception that this proposal isn't as technology neutral as it might be, that it emphasizes fiber rather than anything else. But how do you see that?
Well, we have the targets for 2030. For the moment, the technology that we have, the most advanced technology is fiber. So that's why we have for the in-building infrastructure, we have this condition that it should be fiber. I think it's only normal because we don't have other technologies. If we would have other technologies that we could provide the same level of speed, the same level of trust, I think we can evaluate the technology. But in this case, I think it's only normal that we use fiber. And I think this is also mentioned clearly in the Digital Decade program.
Leonhard, let me come back to you to get your reaction to that. I'm sure you have some thoughts.
Yeah, no, it's very clear and the points are well understood. Like we said before, we also in Vodafone Ziggo support all the new fiber technologies as well when we do new build or when we connect new houses to new connectivity. We use fiber. When there is high-rise buildings, 10 floors and above, we connect them all the way with fiber already these days. As of next year, new build, we will be doing with XGS, PON, one of the fiber technologies as well. So we really believe in a mix of the technologies. Therefore, it's a hybrid fiber coax network in our case. So this mix is there, and the in-home part, it was just mentioned as well, I think indeed is very important. We see that there is a big step up required when it comes to the in-home setup with many of the European customers, also in the Netherlands. And we are working towards what we call an all IP environment, making sure that everything in the house of the customer goes via the IP network, which is a lot more stable and gives a lot more extra capacity on the network to provide extra services. So these are definitely trends that we support from our side as well. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Kostas, a final thought on this technology neutrality question before we move on to other issues, of which there are many.
Thank you. Well, indeed, we all know the advantages of fiber technology. High speeds, scalability, reliability, technology that has been proven in the field, very clear roadmap to the future, energy dissipation, which is also very important. And we need to remember that we also have we have a twin transition objective, digital transformation, but also green transition. So energy dissipation is indeed relevant. So fiber is a very good technology. On the other hand, depending on the situation, and we discussed earlier about rural areas, for example, hybrid technology solutions could be very interesting. Also, for example, fixed wireless access can be an interesting technology for some rural areas where the deployment of fiber is very expensive and cannot be achieved without the use of subsidies. With regards to the in-building cabling that we discussed earlier, well, indeed, if we stay on the basis that we also have alternative technologies that can achieve same quality of service, gigabit per second, for example, quality of service, then we can consider alongside the fiber in the building. So I think this is the best way to go. And if we exclude this point, I believe that Gigabit Infrastructure Act is technology independent. I mean, it addresses coordination of civil work, of access to passive infrastructure, granting permits and administrative procedures. So all these parts of Gigabit Infrastructure Act are indeed technology independent.
Thank you. Turning now to some questions coming in online. Eric Masasic has asked a question for Aline, saying that the GIA expects a situation where fibre and duct infrastructures are available, but there are countries where no duct infrastructures are available. How are the investments into these new infrastructures for ducting protected towards a second mover which avoids the sunk costs and connect consumers with lower costs?
Yes, thank you. So the whole idea of the Gigabit Infrastructure Act is to speed up the deployment of gigabit networks, and I think having this is the most important part of the file. I think there are some cases, specific cases in some member states. I know that in Germany there are problems with not having the necessary infrastructure, but it's exactly what GIA is trying to do. So I think yes, GI is disruptive for some member states, but also helps them in order to develop the infrastructure. So I think it will also help countries which lag behind, such as Germany.
Thank you. Emilio, let me ask you about this question of investment and how to maintain that. Do you see that protection of telco investments will be enshrined? I mean, where are we going in terms of the direction of that? We have a question from P.S. Alexander Benzcek asking why the GIA does not allow protection of telco investments into physical infrastructure by the possibility to refuse ducts access requests based on the Nordic model. So that situation that we've seen, that's a very different model there. They're based on bitstream open access. Why are we not looking at that? Why should we look at that? Are there elements that we could consider? Tell me a bit about that in terms of looking at it from an investment protection point of view.
Okay, thank you for the question. I lost your connection a little bit during a moment, but I think you are asking how to ensure that business models of the different actors across the value chain are not jeopardized by the GIA. And honestly, we believe that GIA is to accelerate the deployment, that it has been said, and this includes, of course, to have a sustainable business model also across the whole value chain. So what we are considering also in the compromise and in the possible mandate for the Council is ensuring that within the flexibility that I was mentioned and adaptation to the different situations, that of course the business models of the different stakeholders across the value chain, and in particular those that are working for Accelerate, because at the end of the day, all the GI objective is to accelerate the deployment of the connectivity, will be respected. And honestly, we believe that this can be achieved, and the GIA should not pose a big risk. We have seen that there are concerns, but taking into account this flexibility that we are talking about, minimum harmonization, but at the same time being flexible, could cope, provide the solution of maintaining the positive business model of the current actors.
Mika, same question to you regarding investment and perhaps consideration of the Nordic model. But also, let me add into that, how do member states strike the right balance between private investment and leveraging public funding or state aid, for example? Talk to us about the costs, the investment balance, and how we get that right.
So those are two different questions. I think the first one regarding investments and the Nordic model, where we see a lot of wholesale-only operators. I think we should keep a clear distinction between the Electronic Communications Code and the objectives of that legislation, which is to promote connectivity, but also to ensure competition in the market. And the GIA, which is to promote the deployment of rollout of networks and has a very different scope and objective. So we should be careful not to, or we should be clearly delineating the two different concepts and not to distort too much the competition on the market and especially on the wholesale markets. Now, that said, the regulatory authorities, they can still impose measures on access to networks if they deem it necessary based on their market assessments. So in terms of granting access to ducts, this is a very specific measure to take by national regulatory authorities, for which you would also need to have reasoned opinions and reasoned arguments. Now, the second question on the investment climate overall, well, as you know, this is also a much debated topic currently in Brussels. And also during our last council discussion of the ministers, it was said by some countries that private investment alone is not sufficient to reach the digital decade targets, We've seen also a commission study being issued before the summer about the digital gap. I think there was some 170 billion euros still to be invested to reach the targets. So some member states are of the view that the state aid rules should be more flexible to allow for a larger mix of state aid measures and private investments. And the Spanish presidency is organizing actually a discussion on the future of telecoms again in the next month. So maybe Emilio, my colleague, can say a bit more about that. And of course, we are all very much awaiting the publication of the Commission with the conclusions of the exploratory consultation that was held before the summer as well.
Thank you, Mika. Well, Emilio, actually, I wonder, do you want to weigh in a little bit on that? Tell us about that meeting.
Well, Mika has explained it quite well, so that there is this informal council of ministers that will be organized in Leon, and one of the points in the agenda is exactly the future of telecommunication, and including how to deal with the needed investment, the combination private-public investment needed to attain the targets of the digital decade. And for that, indeed, the conclusions of the study will be very much welcome, and we are looking forward to the discussions there in that council, because also it could help for the second part of the presidency to have a more clear idea on which kind of measures also could be taken towards the accomplishment of the digital target.
Leo Geert, let me turn to you. We have a question that has come in from Arnan Oberski saying, in the bigger cities of the Netherlands, the telecom providers may obtain a very strong position versus the city governments to ensure profit maximization due to the Gigabit Act. Has this been taken into account, for example, by making a difference between cities and rural areas in the legislation? Is this something that you've noticed?
Well, we do see in the Netherlands, when we look at fiber rollouts, that indeed different approaches are being taken by different operators in different parts of the Netherlands. I think for us as VodafoneZiggo in the Netherlands, we, as I mentioned in my opening statement, 92% coverage of all the households in the Netherlands. These are both in cities and as well as in rural areas. We treat these areas the same when it comes to providing the same type of technology, the same type of HFC infrastructure, with a large part going over fiber and the last mile going over coax. So for us, there is no large distinction between city areas or non-city areas. And therefore, in the end, the products that are being offered to the customers in these 7.2 million households and the 92% coverage are the same everywhere. So from that point of view, no distinction for us. Yeah.
Thank you. Another online question, this time from Andrew Cave. Perhaps, Camilla, you would like to tackle it first. It's regarding a key concern for SMEs, obviously the backbone of the European economy. And the prospect for them is of digital exclusion, as they can't relocate from poorly connected regions. What can or will be done to guarantee EU-wide network coverage? Maybe muted.
Sorry for that. Can you hear me now? I unmuted. Yes, thank you for this question. I still would like to get back a little bit on the issue that was discussed just a second ago by my colleagues, which is indeed on the issue of the wholesale physical access under the GIA and what we proposed. Here, indeed, there are differences between member states. What we proposed is as alternative, basically dark fiber in particular. We know that there are some countries that would like to more see other products which are more virtual products. But here we would like to raise a bit of attention that we should be, on one hand, of course, flexible, but on the other hand, there are also countries that basically do not provide any alternatives to the access to ducts, then basically the access to the ducts, so they don't accept, for example, dark fiber. So we have to find here the right balance. For us, it's important to stay as much as possible in line with our original proposals. Now, going back to the question that was just posted, what we are doing in general for the basically situations of small and medium enterprises which are located in the areas that might not be as much connected as they should. So I think here we have several elements that we are pursuing. One, of course, is what we already discussed, is that the Commission or the European institutions, the Europe goals for the coverage are basically, in terms of the fixed coverage, gigabit coverage, is to reach all by 2030. And as it was indeed mentioned by some of colleagues, panelists before, we are in some countries the situation is almost achieving 100%. I think rightly it was pointed that Netherlands is one of those countries. In some, the situation is really mixed. This is why we also have this general goal, which is for everyone in the Europe to be connected with the gigabit connectivity, and that would be big solution for any problems, for this kind of connectivity problems for small and medium enterprises. We, of course, also have state aid rules, which are very much facilitating the broadband connections. And we have, of course, including very significant investments that are coming from the public money, both nationally, but also from the European fund. So we are doing a lot. We are trying to make sure that this connectivity is ensured for everyone. If I may, because there were also in discussions on the investment gap, indeed, over the summer, we published a study prepared by WIC, which is a very good consultancy that is working a lot on the telecom issues, and the investment needs that they have identified in order to meet the digital decade connectivity targets are 178, if I remember correctly. So they are still significant. Of course, again, the situation differs in different member states and locally between rural areas and the urban areas, but this is the gap that had been identified by the consultant in the study that we requested and which was published over summer.
Well, thank you. Aline, would you like to maybe tackle that SMEs question as well? What's in the Gigabit Infrastructure Act that's going to make them feel comfortable and reassured that the European Union is taking their concerns into consideration?
Well, the fact that the Gigabit Infrastructure Act opens access to physical infrastructure to everybody, so that's something that goes in favor of the SMEs as well. So I think this is clearly something that goes in their direction. And then, of course, when we speak about financing, and this is not in the scope of the Gigabit Infrastructure Act, but I think Camila already mentioned the fact that this is only the first phase in the developing of the connectivity package. We need, of course, state aid. We need European money maybe for developing the networks, and I think this will be the next phase in this broader debate.
And just a follow-up question, Aline, because I know I asked Emilio about this earlier on, but it's coming up again and again in the online questions, this issue of tacit approval. Can you just give me your perspective on that?
So if we want, our objective and the objective of the Commission as well in the proposal is to speed up the deployment of the network. So in order to speed up the deployment, we clearly need very quick procedures. The tacit approval goes in this direction, and I think it's a good idea. I know that in some member states this is difficult because it's not enshrined in the legislation, and for that reason, in our ITRE mandate, we have we take into account this situation, and for those specific cases, we envisage different solutions. But I think the tacit approval, it's a good idea, and of course it puts a little bit of pressure on the local authorities, but we need to find the right balance here between the objective of the GIA, which is to speed up the deployment, and the administrative capacity at local level, at national level, which I think this administrative capacity maybe has to be it needs to be better, I think.
Mika, let me turn to you as well, again, with the same tacit approval principle, because it is one that's come up. Did you or do you anticipate pushback from member states?
Yeah, there was quite some pushback from the member states, and I should clarify that none of the member states are against the objective of speeding up the granting of permits. The main pushback was regarding the way the proposal in Article 7 was written, because it discards the administrative procedures within the member states, and therefore it was written in a bit, let's say, too simplified manner. So that's why it raised some constitutional concerns for member states, discarding also the third parties and property owners, especially in rights of way. It also breaches the competences of local and regional authorities. So that were the main concerns of the member states. Now, looking at the compromise that was struck in the parliament, it's very interesting, and it's definitely something we can work with. And I think the text in the council is traveling in the same direction, that we would need to set a clear signal to the local authorities that a permit has to be granted within a certain mandate. However, for the member states, it is important to have this explicit approval, and not the idea of the tacit approval, which then also can cause legal uncertainty for the operators, for the telecom operators, if they don't have an actual approval, a document that states their permit was approved. Because then they're in a sort of limbo situation. So it is an article that we're still discussing a bit further. The Spanish presidency already made large improvements in their first compromise text, but during our last meeting before the summer, it was clear that we still need to work on it further. And we're also very happy with the outcome in the parliament, taking into account these exceptional situations where member states can actually take a bit more time to assess also, for example, regarding critical infrastructure, whether permits can be granted or not.
Thank you. Kostas, let me bring you in on a slightly different topic. What about the interplay between the GIA and the Gigabit recommendation? Are there any issues that need to be considered there?
Well, thank you, Jennifer. Indeed, Gigabit Infrastructure Act and Gigabit Recommendation have been both presented in February as part of the connectivity package. In principle, they aim at addressing similar issues, civil engineering costs related to the deployment of very high capacity networks, and how we can reduce these costs and speed up the deployment of very high capacity networks. However, there are certain differences, of course, in the two instruments. Gigabit Infrastructure Act is kind of symmetrical regulation addressing access to passive infrastructure from network providers, but also from other utility providers and different infrastructures and public sector. So it's more general with regards to this. Gigabit Recommendation is linked to SMP regulation and addresses issues like more competition and how to keep the balance between speeding up network deployments through joint use of infrastructure, but at the same time there is the competition aspect. So I would see the general objective of both instruments as common, of course, speeding up network deployments, but different, focusing on two different things. Gigabit Infrastructure Act is, in my opinion, broader. Gigabit recommendation focuses on specific part of SMP regulation. But maybe a couple of comments on two other issues that we discussed. One is about SMEs, and SMEs are quite central in the Digital Decade policy program. There is specific objective of the Digital Decade. One of the 4 key objectives of the Digital Decade policy program is to enable small and medium enterprises in Europe to use technologies like AI, cloud, and big data. And this can only happen with access to very high capacity networks for SMEs. And of course, it's true that there are areas where the deployment of very high capacity networks is challenging, and there the main tool is indeed to use public funds and state aid. If I could give an example, in Greece, we are about to start a huge project, connectivity, 1 gigabit per second connectivity for suburban and rural areas, about 800,000 connections. And in these areas, there were no commercial plans for gigabit network deployments. And this is covered through structural funds for Greece. And this is the way to address this digital divide issue.
Thank you. Mika, we're going to come back to this question of timing again. Sébastien Lacroix is saying that some actions meeting the GIA targets are already ongoing in Wallonia. How do we have to look at the transition? Will companies have to be in line with the Digital Decade deadline? What are the time windows? I think Sébastien just wants a good steer on what sort of windows and time frame we should be looking at.
Yeah, that's a very relevant question, of course. Now, hopefully, and I'm actually quite sure that we will close the file or the negotiations on the file with the Parliament together before the end of the mandate, and then it will still take some time, of course, for the lawyer linguists to translate the documents in all the different EU languages, and hopefully it can be published in the official journal by the end of this year. Now, of course, there will be needed sufficient implementation time for the member states and also for the operators, which have quite some new measures to abide with as well. And as I mentioned in my introduction, member states are asking for sufficient time there to make the necessary adaptations and to provide for the necessary resources, especially when it comes to the single information points and the changes that are needed there to digitalize the systems. And for the local authorities, this means extra resources, but also extra financial resources as well. So this is still under discussion, and I think together with the Parliament, we will have to see where we can find a good balance between speed and between effective implementation, of course, because as we said, as we all said at the beginning, we want an instrument that is being enforced efficiently, that is working, that is there in reality, and not just a piece of paper, like we've seen with the BCRD, where in some countries it wasn't really implemented efficiently. So keeping this goal in mind, of course, this will come back during the negotiations with the Parliament. What can be a good implementation time for the member states to make sure that this is a successful instrument?
Well, thank you very much. Tony Shortall has a question on the recent VIC report, Camilla, that you had mentioned there, on the cost of hitting the 2030 target, saying that the report assumes no change in the rate of infrastructure sharing up to 2030. Is this fair? Do you expect a quicker impact for the GIA, or how big an impact do you expect? Camilla, if you tackle that, and then I think I'll ask all of our panelists to give me a response on that question.
So thank you very much. I will start with this one, but I need also to come back on some issues that were raised before. Sorry for that. Indeed, we believe that VIC report is based on very sound methodology. I think it was very well prepared, but indeed it's very much looking into achievement of digital targets under the current DPP, so 2030 targets with the gigabit coverage for everyone and 5G for the populated areas. If it takes enough into account what we would like to do here with GIA, all the streamlining, all the provisions allowing for better access to civil engineering, issues of simplification of procedures, etc., I think it's true that it cannot fully encompass all the elements, and we don't know yet how quickly this regulation will be in place. I just heard Mette mentioning that the member states will need time and the authorities will need time to adjust. I think for us, what is important is to have in full force this regulation as of 2025, because then simply it would be very difficult for it to start working in order to achieve the targets of 2030. So in short, I strongly believe that the report by VIC is very much based on the right methodologies, on the current data. They couldn't take everything into account, including what we don't know how much it would improve on the ground, the provisions of the GIA. Also, it doesn't take fully into account what we are currently discussing, and it was also a bit mentioned by colleagues from the Council, representing the current presidency and the next presidency. We also see that there are certain technological trends that are coming from explanatory consultation that maybe have not been fully put into the current picture. We see the changes in the telecom infrastructure, in the way the telecom operators are operating, in the way how technologies are simply changing the sector significantly, and this is not fully taken into account. Now on the issues that I still wanted to mention on tacit approval, I think this is absolutely essential element of the proposal. And for us, for the Commission, the way we designed this tacit approval is exactly based on what a little bit Mette was criticizing, which is simplification. We really believe that simplification of the procedures is necessary, simplification of administrative process. It also will reduce the efforts needed by the local authorities to go through the approval process. The second thing, which might be worrying some of the member states, and I know that it's raised in the discussions, is that it's only tacit. But we live in the digital world, I don't think in majority of the cases companies need paper per se. This tacit approval is also very much used in many of the member states already. So I just want to add a piece of caveat that we do believe, and of course we are open to negotiations between co-legislators, and we see the developments both in the EP text and upcoming presidency text into probably the right direction. But what is absolutely essential in order for this proposal to work and work quickly is to have short deadlines, to keep the tacit approval. And we already have provisions which are safeguarding some of the elements that Mette was mentioning. For example, protection of property rights is ensured explicitly. And what is also important, competent authorities can extend the deadline in specific cases. So I think we address a lot of the issues that member states have been raising in the discussions, and we really hope that tacit approval will remain a very important part of the proposal and very effective one. And finally, on the interrelation between GIA and the gigabit recommendation, I think Kostas made all the necessary points. The gigabit recommendation is a specific instrument related to the situation when there is significant market power of companies on the market, specified market. So it's very much specific type of regulation, why the Gigabit Infrastructure Act is symmetrical regulation. So in case when we in some cases have access provisions envisaged under the gigabit recommendation. So basically the remedies are imposed by the regulators, specific remedies on specific operators under specific circumstances. These rules would prevail. Sometimes they go much stronger because there would be different pricing, for example, envisaged in such cases, because GI is of course looking into fair and reasonable concept, while regulators might look more into the cost orientation. Sorry. Thank you very much. I have 3 points, but I wanted to make sure that I also refer to that.
No problem at all, Camilla, and very timely as we only have a few minutes left. So I think you've wrapped up very nicely your position. Eileen, let me turn to you. I'm going to ask you a question from João Goncalves asking, do you agree that the GIA will have more impact in the 27 member states today that are far more reaching than even the 2030 digital decade targets? So what sort of impact do you expect? Feel free to answer that, but also to give us your closing arguments and discussions about how you think things are going to go as we look to the trialogue and we look to the next year.
Well, the digital decade targets and the GIA are compatible. Actually, it's the GIA. It's a way in which we implement the digital decade targets, and I think we took a lot of inspiration from the digital decade program when we discussed and negotiated also here in the Parliament the Gigabit Infrastructure Act. I would say that this piece of legislation it's essential, and I agree with all the speakers that said already that we need it to be adopted as soon as possible. I reiterate the fact that we are expecting the Council to also adopt its position as soon as possible and then to start negotiations. I hope that we'll manage to have a successful negotiations with the Spanish presidency and with the Belgian presidency. And I'm looking forward to these negotiations. Of course, we are, as always, very open to discuss with the stakeholders and to listen to all the ideas, the good idea that comes from them. Thank you.
Emilio, let me turn to you for a final reaction to what you've heard so far. I will throw in as a final gambit the position of the Parliament to abolish extra fees of intra-EU calls. How do you think that's going to go in the trilogue negotiations from your perspective? And give us a wrap-up view ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question because actually in the Council we are so far not yet discussing this because it was not part of the Commission proposal. So far we don't have had a discussion on these points on a mandate, but of course we anticipate that this may be one of the tricky issues in the discussions and in the negotiations in the trilogue with the European Parliament. But we need to gather with all the colleagues from other member states to see how it is going. Coming back to the point, I think for the wrap-up, that important thing is I think the three institutions agree on the importance of the GIA, and that we are all aiming at having the negotiations concluded before the end of the mandate of the Commission and of the Parliament, and because it's important for completing the digital decade targets of the EU. So from the Spanish presidency, what we are trying to do is to look at the different concerns, and we have talked the need of flexibility and the need of considering the different legal system and situation in the different member states. This is what we are putting in the table. We believe that with these proposals, and by the way, we have seen some of these concepts brought into the mandate of the Parliament. So there should be some room to achieve that, and we believe that if we manage to have to strike the right balance to ensure, again, and this is important, an effective implementation later on, rather than going quickly, only quickly, then this could be important. We have hopes that with the proposals that we will make for the new compromise, we can be very close to an agreement in the Council, but we have to see also the reactions of the member states. So again, this is an important file for the Spanish presidency. We are aiming of having a clear mandate before the conclusion of the Spanish president. The sooner we could have it, the sooner we could start the negotiations with the Parliament, the better. But we need to ensure that there is a good text on the table.
Thank you very much, Emilio. Mika, coming to you for your last intervention. I would be pleased if you could address the question of the investment gap, but also react to what you've heard from your fellow panelists and give us a look ahead as well as the closing remark.
Yes, indeed. It's a very positive file. It's a good file for the telecom sector, for the industry, but also for consumers and for member states. So you see also in this discussion, there's a lot of willingness from the co-legislators to make sure we get the best deal possible and a good legislation that is effective. I think from the Council perspective, also important to stress that member states should have the flexibility to still take those targeted local national initiatives. And on the investment gap, yeah, I see that the GIA is one part of the puzzle. Of course, there is still the code. There's an entire toolbox that is that policymakers in the member states have to their disposition. Also, when it comes to state aid, so there's many pieces of the puzzle that will help in promoting broadband and reaching the digital decade targets. On intra-EU calls, there's a strong signal from the Parliament, a strong desire there to abolish the surcharges. But as Emilio said, we still need to discuss it in the Council. But I'm sure we will get there, and I'm very positive we will have a good compromise between the co-legislators.
Thank you. Kostas, as Mika just said there, the GIA is but one part of the overall puzzle in reaching those 2030 digital decade targets. Is it the right piece? Is it going in the right place? Give us your closing thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. And maybe one comment about the investment gap discussion. I don't know in details the assumptions of the week report that gives this estimate of 174 billion euros towards digital decade policy targets and connectivity targets for 2030. I'm sure they have a set of valid assumptions, but infrastructure sharing is indeed very important and should be considered in this kind of analysis. So the overarching question for this panel was, can the Gigabit Infrastructure Act be a global leadership opportunity for the European Union? And I would say that the digital decade policy program objectives are indeed very ambitious. And if we are successful in achieving all these objectives, European Union will have a leadership position worldwide. There are several objectives quantitatively defined that are very ambitious, and we need to go for them. Gigabit Infrastructure Act is for sure one key enabler towards these objectives and clearly in the right direction. But there are also other tools and other policy interventions needed to make sure that we achieve these very ambitious objectives towards 2030.
Thank you very much. Leo Geert, unenviably, when everything has been said, the last word falls to you to give us your closing thoughts. How optimistic are you about the Giga Infrastructure Act? Where do we see it fitting in the coming decade?
Yeah, thanks for that. And yes, obviously we are very positive about this. And yeah, I also, in line with the comments that were made earlier in the call, I also want to emphasize the fact that we see that the HFC technology has a great and bright future ahead. It will have a lifespan of another 20, 30 years, especially with the tested, with the high speeds that have been done over the last few months. We also believe that the HFC technology is the right technology also for the in-home connectivity with the customer, and that we're able to build on that going forward. And with the lifespan that we're looking at, if I'm not mistaken, this would also include the lifespan of the GIA policy framework. So yeah, I think in that sense, we're in good shape. And I fully support the statements that were made by the previous presenters as well. So many thanks for giving us the opportunity to be here.
Thank you very much. And indeed, thank you very much to all our panelists. I do not envy you the work you have ahead of you in the trialogue. It's going to be a hard few months before we get to the end of the mandate. So good luck and good work. Please keep us posted on what's happening with the Gigabit Infrastructure Act. Certainly one that we are going to see more of as it goes through trialogue and the legislative process even into next year. If you're interested in that, and of course other debates on Euractiv, keep following us online. Use the hashtag EA Debates. Follow us on Euractiv on the various social media channels, whichever one you choose. But all of us send a great day wish to you, and please join us again soon.